Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again to the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. Our guests today are Rupert and Jan Grey, the principal protagonists and stars of the film Romantic Road. And I want to start by thanking them and their producer Oliver McGarvey for making it possible for us to see the film before it has been generally released. If anyone is online from Australia, New Zealand or Portugal, I'm sorry that the distribution arrangements mean that we've not been able to make the film available to you now. That's because it's about to be released in all of those countries. The upside is that you will be able to see the film in a theatre setting around the end of this month. It had been due for release when COVID-19 lockdowns were implemented, so having been the first film not to have been released in Australia because of the pandemic, it will now be the first film to come out after restrictions are lifted. I hope that you've all been able to watch the film. For anyone who has not yet done so, it will remain available for a few more days with the link and password that you have been sent. But they will expire before long, so I encourage you not to miss it. It is a film of great warmth, charm, and insight. The founders and early members of the RSAA, or the Central Asian Society as it then was, did a lot of exploring of unknown places. Rupert and Jan's journey is different. The places are well known, but the exploration is real for all that. Exploration of a way of travelling, exploration of relationships, potentially coloured by the past colonial era, and it is about a journey with a destination, the Chobi Mela Festival in Bangladesh, and it is about a purpose beyond exploring, about human rights in Bangladesh. And I hope that in addition to discussing the epic journey that takes Rupert and Jan there, I hope that our discussion can get on to that subject of human rights in Bangladesh and the role and career of Shahidul Alam, the founder of the Chobi Mela Festival. For those that have not come across Rupert Grey before, in his professional life, he's been a barrister specialising in libel and copyright law. Jan was a probation officer when they married in 1977, and their honeymoon was spent driving around Europe in a 1936 Austin 7. So Jan knew what she was getting into at a very early stage. As a family, Rupert and Jan took their daughters on trips to Borneo, the Pamirs, the Arctic, and the Bay of Bengal, among other adventures. Rupert is also a photographer, an activity that has overlapped with his legal work. Moderating questions today, we have Sophie Ibbotson, who many of you will know. Sophie has been active in the Society for some years and is a member of its council. Although her expertise is now primarily in Central Asia, India was where her studies began. For today's event, she brings also the unique qualification of having once driven a tuk-tuk from Darjeeling to Bishkek. And it is to Sophie that I now hand over.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I think I can say to you both, Rupert and Jan, on behalf of everybody who's had the chance to watch the film, what a fantastic experience it was, feeling stuck at home in lockdown and yet being able to adventure with you to what are without doubt some of the most beautiful, in some cases quite wild places on the planet. And the wanderlust experience from the quiet of my living room in Reading has been absolutely fantastic, and I couldn't have wished for a better experience of travelling with you, albeit virtually. I know that a number of you who will have seen it will have lots and lots of questions for Jan and Rupert, and at the bottom of your screens is a Q&A box. If you type in questions that you have, I will see them, Michael will see them, and then we will ask some of them to Jan and Rupert. But in my role as moderator, I also take the privilege of being able to ask all the questions I want, of which there are very, very many. So I'm going to kick off first and say to you that I've always felt there's a huge, huge draw of India, probably more so than anywhere else I've ever been fortunate enough to go. And when I talk to many other people at the Society, it's the same. It gets under your skin. And even people who've never yet had the opportunity to go have this romantic idea of India, this fairy tale place, pulling them from England out to India at some stage in their lives. And I wanted to ask you what it was about India, and then by extension about Bangladesh, that made you choose those two destinations above all others for your epic adventure.
India has been part of our joint lives ever since we travelled there in 1980. We spent a good 4 or 5 months, maybe 6 there then, doing a lot of trekking in the Himalayas. And it was very much the backdrop to our sort of family life. And so we took our children back actually to Bangladesh rather than India a good many years later. So that was one layer. Another layer was the fact that my family's been involved in India for several generations, going right back to the tea, as in Earl Grey's tea, which was a creation, or at least was brought on board by my however many grandfathers back it is. And my father was there in the war, and serving us in the RAMC. And his father before him was a barrister in India, working in Lahore. So there's a lot of background about that. And I suppose the last point is that Jan and I wanted to undertake a journey where we really could get away from the life that at least I've been leading anyway in professional terms, on a sabbatical basis, because it's still going on now. And this was, I think, our third sabbatical, so it's in a long tradition of wanting to do not so much unusual journeys, but journeys that suited our particular idiosyncrasies and took us to places that we thought would work for us and that were out of the way. Is that a fair description?
I think it's very fair. I just add something to that. I don't have any family connection with India, and I've been a few times now, and it is a very, very extraordinary place. But I don't feel this passionate draw that some people do. I feel about India the way I feel about lots of other countries, including our own. There are some completely wonderful, remarkable, marvelous things about it. The people, the landscapes, the traditions, the culture, all sorts of things. And there's some really, really dreadful things. And I'm not accusing India or Bangladesh being guilty of those any more than anywhere else is. But I don't find this allure the same way, Sophie, that you've just referred to. I've never had that. I've never had an antipathy, but I do feel, yes, I say about most other countries that I've known, that there's an ambivalence. There are good bits and there are bad bits, basically.
The dichotomy of the good and bad is actually something that comes out in the film, because there are definite high points and definite low points. And I think it's one of your daughters who comments about the contrasts between the apparent privilege of your journey in the vehicle and that of the poverty. And this is, I think, probably a question for you first, Jan, is it's inescapable, the poverty in India, alongside all of its brilliance. And how do you respond to that, particularly when you're faced to it on a very physical level on a day-to-day basis? It's not that you were staying in 5-star hotels and could escape from the noise and the traffic and the pollution and the poverty. How did you manage that, particularly over such a sustained period?
I think because I'd been before and other very poor places, I knew what it was going to be like in principle anyway. And there are times when your heart nearly stops because something around you, or a lot of things around you, are so terrible. And I suppose the only way I tried to deal with that was that in every interpersonal relationship that we had, we would be as respectful as possible. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And it also seems, and you've captured this very well in the film, that the vehicle itself and your journey causes a huge amount of joy and excitement for other people. And I've certainly found this myself, both with driving the tuk-tuk, but also with a Unimog, a big truck that I had, that there is a huge novelty to people, and particularly to women, driving unusual vehicles in India. And you always attract a crowd of kids and young people, and there is a great excitement about what you're doing and a curiosity to find out more.
Exactly, very much, we used to find this when we travelled with our children, that if you have small children with you, you have a bond with almost anybody, and if you're in a funny old vehicle, that creates another bond, another bridge to cross the divide of very different lives.
I think we can add to that by the other dimension was having Oliver along with us, and they assumed he was our son, of course, which he's not. He's a godson, but that was sort of incidental. But traveling with him added another dimension, because a lot of the young people related to him, and they wanted to know how it was that a 23-year-old, whatever he was then, about 23, 24,
yeah.
Could be traveling, who's not a son, could be traveling with two, what Brom described rather irritatingly as elderly persons. And that actually went down very, very well. And he became as much of a focal point for his own personality and his way of relating to the local people as we did in the car. So it was a very successful sort of a combination that attracted people's interest. And it kind of overlaid some of the potential dividing points, such as the disparity between local poverty and the wealth represented by the symbol of a Rolls-Royce, and also, of course, the colonial legacy. It tended to sidetrack that as well, which never really featured very much during the journey. That
was something that I was expecting to feature far, far more, because obviously the car itself was the car of choice of the Maharajas, and large numbers of Rolls-Royces were produced by the Indian market, often given as gifts or bribes to ensure a certain level of compliance with what the British wanted. And I didn't know how the vehicle was going to be received in that respect. I mean, obviously people love to see classic cars of any kind, but at the same time, there is a growing recognition in India and to some extent in the UK that the empire caused a huge amount of problems for India. And although we tend to look back at it with rose-tinted spectacles, actually there are some very serious legacy problems. And I don't know how much did those discussions ever come up, or not so much in that particular journey?
Well, we were talking about it the other day. The film's been quite widely reviewed in Australia, and some of the reviews totally ignore it, but others focus really quite strongly on the colonial legacy and the conflict between what we were to be doing, which was travelling on a journey to a human rights festival on the one hand, and on the other we were conveying ourselves in the symbol of wealth and empire. Probably a symbol that's more powerful than any other obvious brand you can think of. And one of the thoughts, well, the main thought we both had, was that this had become much more of a talking point in the context of making a film and other people seeing it than it was on the journey. Mm. It never, ever really came up in the journey at all. And I think that's partly because of the way we travel and the way we relate to other people on the road, but also because the car is not only a symbol of empire to some people, but to many people in India, it's a symbol of absolutely, totally amazing engineering. And engineering is a very big thing in India. And so the moment we opened the bonnet, the idea of talking about the colonial legacy just didn't come into it. They wanted to know how it worked. And as they used to say, what was that phrase, love? How many kilometers? Or the first question was how many kilometers? And eventually I worked out that what they were really asking was how many miles to the gallon?
Yeah.
And all the other questions that followed from that. Is that a fair answer?
Mm-hmm. How easy was it to get the parts that you need and to keep that vehicle on the road? Because I certainly have spent days of my life stood in workshops, sort of having various vehicles hit with bricks and hammers and spanners and fixing them together with whatever happens to be lying around. I'm imagining that you can't do that so much with the roller, and that the parts are fairly bespoke.
We took quite a lot of parts with us. All the parts that were manageable in in physical terms, in terms of size and weight. And I don't think we needed any of them, as I recall.
We needed a piece of wood for the window.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, the door started falling off as we were going across the tar desert because it was so hot, and of course that was made of English timber. But we bought some spare wood, so that was fine. We had a major problem not being able to start it. That took 2 days to sort out. And I never understood why it didn't start, but anyway, eventually it did. But it did take a couple of days to work that one through. But no, it wasn't really a problem. We had the major one was we kept on knocking the exhaust pipe off. So we spent an awful lot of time in blacksmiths at the side of the road, welding exhaust pipes together, and that was just terrific fun.
It was fun.
That was a real door opening to a British community, because everybody wanted to come and see who we were and what this car was about.
I imagine the mechanics as well must have been in their absolute element, being allowed anywhere near that vehicle.
Absolutely, they loved it. It was a fairly battered vehicle, so it didn't have about it a presence of it didn't send a message of wealth. It sent a message of, I can't believe this car's still going. How has that happened? And so there wasn't that barrier of wealth, because it clearly wasn't a rich man's car, just because it's so battered.
And also, I imagine you found this in the tuk-tuk, that unlike modern cars everywhere, including India, people tend to have windows closed and the aircon on. And obviously the Rolls doesn't have aircon, so our windows were almost always wide open. So whenever you paused anywhere, you were actually very often very close to people. You weren't in any way separated by glass or whatever. So that was
that's a good point.
It was a very yes, it was a little barrier that wasn't there.
I did see in several of the shots of the film that you picked up passengers hanging onto the outside of the Rolls. And certainly that was the case with the tuk-tuks as well, because there was no door on the sides, that suddenly you'd realise you've got somebody riding a shotgun behind you.
Yes, yes, that was very, very funny though. And we, before we went, we were rather worried about the running boards, so we had those strengthened before we left. And we also, rather cunningly, got a special device which Rolls don't tend to have, whereby you can lock the door from the inside with a sort of catch. Because the first thing they do when they jump on the running board, the kids, is to grab onto the door handles, because there's nothing else to grab onto. And then, of course, they open, and then they go flying all over the place. So we travelled always with the catches on, so they could use the door handle as an anchor point.
It sounds like a very sensible solution.
And it worked really well. I mean, one or two did fall off, but they didn't seem to cause any grief, so that was fine.
One thing that sorry, please.
No, the Rolls doesn't go very fast. I don't know about your tuk-tuk, but the Rolls, I mean, it can go a good speed, but on a not terribly good road, it doesn't go very fast.
One thing that I did find, having a foreign with the Unimog, having a foreign car with foreign plates, is that you do attract quite a lot of attention from local police. And initially, I think some of them are out for what they can get, but as soon as they stop you and start talking, then you end up having some very interesting discussions. And usually there's an invitation to come for tea, or there's a photo opportunity, or they want to sit in the driver's seat. And I'm sure you found that with the Rolls, that everybody wants their picture taken and their moment.
Yes. I mean, there must have been 1 million photographs taken of the Rolls. It was utter. I mean, people would they drop alongside us as we were going on, and the guy on the back of the bike, or for that matter on the front of the bike, would be out there with his camera like this, not even looking where he was going. So no, there must be millions of photographs of the Rolls about players, and it wasn't a calling card, but it was a very good device for getting to talk to people. There was no problem about what you talk about. Rather like when you're traveling with children, as Jan said, with anything that does that to create relationships with the people through whose land you're traveling is a huge bonus.
A question has popped up on the screen from Mike Holman. He says, my old commanding officer once told me that there were only 2 ways to do India: with a rucksack on your back and staying in hostels, and in 5-star hotels. What kind of accommodation did you favour?
It's a good question. we were very lucky to have a good friend in Udaipur who introduced us to the Raja of Badrujun, which is a very unknown, remote fort in the middle of the Thar Desert. But of course, rather like Paddy Lee Fermor, as he walked across Europe in 1933, once you met one princess, you've met the lot. And we sort of went from, it was only in Rajasthan for a month or something, we sort of went from one Maharaja's sort of palace of faded grandeur to another. So we had, the first month was absolutely brilliant. And then the moment we got out of Rajasthan and into UP, it is a completely different landscape. There is no Maharajas.
Also, we had no contacts now.
And we had no contacts, and there's no palaces, and there's actually virtually no hotels, and there's no infrastructure, and it's said to be the Wild West. Many of our friends said we should never take the risk of driving the Rolls through UP. And in fact, we had the most fantastic time. And we stayed in little cheap sort of salesmen's hotels for sort of £2 a night. And the only condition we imposed on ourselves was that if we could, and we almost always did, we found a place that had a compound with a night watchman. But that's India. That happens everywhere.
It's a sensible precaution to take, not necessarily because anybody will deliberately harm your vehicle, but you never know who's going to come flying around a corner far too fast in their own vehicle and take you out by accident.
Right.
There were several moments in the film where you mentioned about the dacoits and the insurgents and obviously driving at night. And I was wondering if there were any points in the journey where you actually felt worried for your safety.
No.
There were one or two occasions when in Nagaland and leaving Nagaland, when everybody we talked to, all the locals were very, very nervous for us. And we had a guide who was extremely nervous and wouldn't get out of the car to go behind a bush without taking a machete with him. So that really created an atmosphere of, this isn't very safe. Though in fact, we were always fine. But I think, and again, I wonder if this echoes your experience, the most frightening night of the whole trip was just near the end, when we were given misleading information, and we spent the whole night driving across the Western Ghats in the pitchy dark, and that was rather scary in itself. And then we got to the so-called quadrangle, whatever it's called, of the Indian motorways, the 4 motorways that go around the continent. And driving on a motorway at night with lorries with no lights and camels on the motorway, it was, I think, by far the most frightening time.
I agree. I mean, I think of all of the time I've spent in India, driving at night is my least favourite thing. And it does come down to other people not having lights on and no idea where they are, and they come out of nowhere. And it's not just the cars, but pedestrians suddenly in the middle of the motorway, or people on bicycles, or people on bicycles with wardrobes balanced on the back of them. And you are trying to look everywhere simultaneously and respond very, very quickly. But it's this almost like being in a horrific video game, and not knowing where somebody's going to jump out from next.
No, that's absolutely right. No, there were one or two alarming moments, one or two near misses in terms of big trucks. And traveling through Assam, which is always it's a most wonderful place. We've been there before, but it is a part of India that is very unsettled, with tribal conflicts very much in the air, and a general antipathy to being part of India, and they don't feel they are part of India. So that was quite complicated, but I never felt at any moment that we were at risk of being shot or arrested or anything else. I think we were lucky.
There's a question here from Ruth Le Guin saying, did you learn anything new about India and Bangladesh relative to your earlier experiences? And I'm particularly interested to hear a bit more about Bangladesh, because obviously the majority of the film is within India and the majority of the journey was within India. But at the same time, the finale and the focus of where you're trying to get to is Bangladesh. And I was just like to hear a little bit more about that, and by extension about the festival.
So if you're right, that's probably more down to me, because I've been going to the festival more than Jan has over the years. But it started when we took the children there in 1992, when they were aged between 5 and 11, 3 of them, 3 girls. And for reasons that don't matter, we ended up on a boat in the Sundarbans with a chap who self-described himself as a king of the Sundarbans, but he was sort of cross between a king and a pirate. So it was very colourful and very exciting. And he was the MP, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's not a pirate or a villain or indeed a great man. And he was a wonderful chap. But on that boat was Shahidul Alam, that we didn't know then, but that's when we first met him. And he became a very good friend. And then he involved me in the festival, which he had not yet then started. It wasn't to start for another 8 years. And he then persuaded the British Council to ask me to come out and give a talk on the law of copyright, which is my field. And that festival happened to be 2 years, and that was the festival, I think it was the 7th or 8th one, that we were at in the Rolls. He invited us to be guest of honor for the festival. So I was seeing, to answer your question, Bangladesh then through the prism of the previous times I'd had there, which were quite a lot. And Jan was going back there for the first time. And of course, it's a very different country. It's a country that swung steadily towards being less of a secular nation and moving more towards being a Muslim nation, with a lot of complications that ensue from that. And the political repression has got much greater in the last, including since we were there in 2013. And so that backdrop was a very important part of our perception of Bangladesh as we saw it then. And it is still like that, which is why Shahidul was in jail last year for 3 months and was tortured for photographs he'd taken of rioting in the streets. So I've slightly gone in a different direction. So if do you want to take any angle?
I think that's very, very important, because actually the contemporary situation is something that none of us can escape for. And when you're travelling, particularly the way you are, very close to the ground, close to local people, the political change and the human rights situation is very, very important. You mentioned that he had been in prison. Is the festival still ongoing? Is that?
I think it's now under threat from COVID-19. But certainly before COVID-19, it was going to happen. It very nearly didn't happen last time. And Shahidul emerged from jail relatively, I think about 2 months before it was scheduled to happen. And everybody assumed it wouldn't. But he's surrounded by an extraordinary cadre, if that's the right word, a group of passionate photographers, passionate young men and women who believe very strongly in the right of free speech and freedom of movement. They gathered round and the festival happened, and I went, and it was absolutely extraordinary. This very powerful sense of the freedom of thought and speech gathering together in the face of a government that really is not very tolerant of freedom of speech, particularly if they don't agree with it. And against the backdrop of Shahidul having been tortured and then becoming Person of the Year for Time magazine, it was it's a very powerful moment, both for me personally, but also for the nation, or for that part of the nation, which is drawn to the festival and attends the festival. It's quite a big event. It takes over streets in the centre of Dhaka.
The human dimension of the story is actually very, very important, not just in terms of the people you meet along the way, but also your relationship with one another. And I was wondering if you could talk to us about what you feel are the personal attributes that are key to a successful adventure, but also to a successful marriage, because for the two of you, it seems that they're very much entwined.
Okay. A successful adventure. I think that the first point to make about it, a successful adventure, is that you can't plan it to the last in detail. You can't, for me, you can't have an outline of where you're going to go, what you're going to do, when you're going to be there, and a developed program. So we set off not really quite knowing where we were going to be when. But what we did do was a great deal of research into what the places we were going, where their major features were, where the options were for staying, what little we could find out about the roads and the availability of petrol, and who we knew in the area who might be useful, who we knew if things went wrong, friends we might want to see, or cultural reference points that were important to us. And with that research, as we went, we developed the journey as we went. So there was an agreeable sense of unknownness about it and uncertainty, and therefore adventure, but an equally agreeable sense that we were pretty well researched and would know how to get out of a tight corner if we got into one. I think Jan might have a different answer or a different angle.
No, maybe a different angle. I think and I imagine you feel the same, the more preparation, which Rupert did meticulously for several years, the more preparation you can have, not to make everything fixed and firm about we'll arrive at such and such point, such and such a day, not that sort of thing, but where do we think we might like to go? How can we get there? Roughly what are the roads like? Who can we turn to? All those sort of baseline of information that you need for a long journey. And Rupert had done, I say, a lot of that, and because we had various friends around, they were able to put in touch with other people. So I think it's the preparation, and then being, well, in terms of, for instance, practically prepared. So we had a lot of spares in the car. We had a reasonably good medical kit. We had, fortunately, money in the bank. All those things to make it possible, and then have the just accept that things may not always be as you anticipate or as you would wish. And if they're not, then working out together how to deal with it. So I think it's a combination of preparation and then working with what's there. I think that's fair.
Yeah, absolutely. You sparked some thought. And a good example of the kind of planning I'm talking about is that when we did break down really seriously, and I absolutely couldn't, having racked my brains, figure out how to get the car going again. We had met some years before a person in London who either had been or was at the time the secretary to the Maharaja of Jaipur, where we were. Sorry, Jodhpur. And I remembered after 2 days, I suddenly remembered Jodhpur's got plenty of Rolls-Royces. We knew that. He therefore must have a Rolls-Royce mechanic. So I rang the private secretary. I had the number. And within 2 minutes, we had the Maharaja's Rolls-Royce Wallers, and they fixed it in 5 minutes. And I just love that sort of, that connection with some lucky chance of meeting in some group in London, with getting out of a tight corner 5 years later in Rajasthan. And the journey was full of those sort of things.
I think serendipity plays a very important role in adventures, actually. Yes, the preparation is hugely important, but also luck. Certainly not to be discounted, whether it's the people you meet or the weather you encounter or a particularly badly placed pothole.
No, that's right. And I think the instinct to seize the moment when something unexpected happens and looks like an interesting lead to follow. And when the local press first figured out or became aware of what we were doing, which was in Assam. Well, it was Kalimpong. By the time we got to Kalimpong, we were going up to where are we going? We're going to Majuli Island about a week later, and a person in Majuli Island had seen the news with a little tiny 10-second or whatever it was footage of us traveling, and he was making a film. And that's how he got involved with making the film within the film, when you see it in the film. And he saw us on the news, and we waited till we arrived, then came out of the darkness and said, would we please act in this film? And I said, certainly not, we've got better things to do. and Oliver said, don't be ridiculous, we can borrow all the equipment, say yes. and so I said yes. And then that led down that extraordinary route of the film being made. and 2 years later, we got home, we got a call saying, would we come and make the speech at the launch of the film in the UK and the centre of the Assamese sort of society in Britain, which is in Woking. So there we were 2 years later at the opening of the launch of this film with all the Assamese people in Woking. I mean, I just love those things that go off in all different directions. And we're still in touch with the film producer. He's a lovely man.
That situation actually may answer the next question, but you may also have a different view. Christian says, I can imagine the whole journey was quite intense, but is the one situation that you consider to be the most impressive?
Impressive, did you say?
Yes, or memorable. I mean, something that stands out in your mind and will always be unforgettable.
The trouble is there are quite a lot of them. I'm not trying to get out of it, but there are sort of chance encounters with a person who you will never see again that remain with you. And then there are moments when we'd been in the Himalayas before, but we did a short trek while we're there in the most amazing weather, and just seeing the mountains illuminated all day and then all night by moonlight was absolutely unforgettable. So those really magnificent memories related to landscape of different sorts, because Bangladesh is very, very beautiful. A lot of the journey through Bangladesh is very beautiful. And then there are people and encounters and markets. There are lots, aren't there? What would you choose? Sir?
Well, I think I'd almost go back to, and that's quite right, there's far too many really to count. But I do remember watching Shahidul on the roof of the Rolls in the opening procession, Chebby Mela, which is a very wild and riotous affair, you can see from the film. And there he was, I mean, he's probably the most famous human rights activist in Bangladesh. In fact, he definitely is. So he's a very prominent figure. And there he was, the man who represents the rights of poor people against the rich, sitting on top of a bloody Rolls-Royce, surrounded by all his mates with playing trumpets and shouting and taking millions of photographs and cameras everywhere. And he was grinning like a Cheshire cat. And I just thought how utterly extraordinary it is to have the symbol of human rights sitting on top of the symbol of wealth and not thinking that there's anything wrong with that. And understanding the cross connection, the cross fertilization between the two, and making a virtue of it. And I just thought it was amazing.
It's certainly one of the happiest looking moments in the film, and the excitement is palpable, even sort of as an audience several thousand miles away.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And Oliver captured it very well. There was quite a lot of footage there from that was taken as well by others in the festival, because I've taught them all in the university photography there, well, not all of them, but a lot of them, and I've always been on hand to help with any copyright issues. Of course, when we asked for help finding footage to show what we wanted, they were wonderfully cooperative, and there was some there from the earlier festivals when I'd been there, as it were, just me with obviously no Rolls-Royce. And some very funny footage there with some of the great curators, photographic curators of our time, and photographers of our time, have been part of that festival. And involving them in the film with earlier footage was terrific. And I love that bringing together of the different worlds of travel and law and photography and human rights and adventurous journeys and us two being together. It was just amazing.
I have a question from Faraz now. It says, it seems that like many couples, you have different appetites for risk, which balance each other out rather nicely. Were there any moments on the trip when you differed in your views of whether taking a certain risk was a step too far?
Yes. Love, I think you better. We were setting off, Jan referred earlier to the Western Ghats moment when we got lost. And I was quite determined. I wanted to get to where we were going that night? To Pune that night. We had the most fantastic house to stay in Pune. At least we thought it was, and indeed it proved to be. That a four-story timber frame house in the 19th century. It was empty, and that it belonged to a friend. And I wanted to get there, and I looked at the map and I thought this will be no problem. Jan said it's too far, and we didn't know the road, and it was taken through some very wild country across the mountains, between the coastal road and the road up on the Deccan that leads up to Pune. And it got later and later and later, and there was absolutely nobody there. And Jan was getting rather sort of, you always tell when Jan getting cross, she doesn't say so much. And I realised that I hadn't made quite the right move, and we had no idea where we were. And then we found some lights, and we went in. It was the sort of the Western Ghats equivalent of a pub, a sort of restaurant type affair. And we went in, and they couldn't believe their eyes when we walked in. It was the middle of the night. We came out of nowhere. There was no town for 50 miles on either side, and we appeared. It looked really quite suspicious, and of course we were a bit suspicious of them after a while. And I thought Jan was right. And as you said afterwards, I always insist on following the advice that I think suits me, and which has probably got some truth in it.
But the end of that story of that night also has a wonderful sort of travelling end to it, because we eventually arrived in Pune hours and hours and hours later, and we had a phone number for our friend who's back in Mumbai, and we were completely lost. And we rang him, and he said, "Stay where you are, and my friend will come on his motorbike." So we waited about half an hour. Eventually, a friend arrived on the motorbike, and I said, "Follow him." Half an hour back to the other end of the city, and big metal gate, and everything dark inside. And we thought, what on earth is going to happen? Anyway, they opened us, let us in this beautiful house, as Rupert said, with the odd light on. It was about 10:30, 11, and we'd had nothing to eat since a long time ago. And we said to this chap, is there someone who can go and buy something from a street stall? Thinking everything was closed. And he said, "Oh yes, come with me." And he led us about 100 yards through another big gate, and inside was a London bus, all beautifully, immaculately maintained and sitting there. And he said, next door. So we went next door, and it was a highly westernized restaurant full of people, women smoking. You never see that in India. Women smoking, women drinking wine, everybody chatting, with a London bus outside the door. And half an hour earlier, we'd been stuck in the middle of nowhere, not knowing where we were going to be for the next ever. No. And there we were. It was absolutely extraordinary.
No, we had a really great evening. We sat there drinking till about 2 o'clock in the morning. It was wonderful.
One final question, which actually 2 people have asked, and that is, what is next for the Rolls-Royce?
I'll mention first of all the last one we did, which was now 3 years ago. We shipped the Rolls to Gdansk, it used to be Danzig, and from there we spent 4.5 months driving through Eastern Europe and ended up at the Piraeus, where we put it on another boat, and back home she came. So that was a really good successor journey to India, because it was different. There was wonderful contrasts, and also quite exciting because there's a lot of very empty country that we went through. The next one was going to be this year, but for obvious reasons it hasn't happened. I found a ship that can take the Rolls to Tacoma, the port for Seattle on the west coast of America. And from there we want to drive north to Alaska and then take the ferry down the west coast, stopping off at various places. It's a country I used to live in when I was much younger, so I know bits of it quite well. And it's sort of back to the early pioneering days, and for me, it made my mind, and that very remote part of the Western Canada, which is full of wildlife and not many people. That would be a really great place to take the Rolls.
I think it's a spectacular adventure for you and the car.
Yes, no, it would, because there are a lot of dirt roads, and the Rolls tires don't do very well on dirt roads, so we'll have to be careful.
Thank you both so much for sharing your time with us today, and also for letting us preview the film. As I said at the beginning, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it's been a real highlight of my week and indulged my wanderlust. I will hand you back over to the capable hands of Michael, who I'm sure will...
Sophie, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thank you,
Michael.
Yeah, thank you from me too. If I may, it's a question of my own, really. And this is going more to the sort of Bangladeshi situation. Shahidul is clearly a very remarkable individual in a number of ways. But what about your own future involvement. I mean, Chobimela is known as a photography festival, but it's clearly also an event with some political and activist ramifications too, and Shahidul wouldn't have been arrested if it wasn't. Is there an aspect of, is that also an aspect for you in your involvement? I mean, libel and copyright law are not an obvious trajectory into human rights, but is that a direction you are yourself going in at all?
Mainly, Michael, I've been a libel lawyer and a copyright lawyer, not a human rights lawyer. In fact, I wouldn't myself out as a human rights lawyer at all. Copyright is fundamentally important for the survival of photographers, because that's what protects their assets, so to speak. And photographers are a vital cog in the machine that brings to our attention all over the world the abuse of human rights. And what Shahidul has done in the most extraordinary way is to harness the power of the image to the message he wants to convey, and we all want to be conveyed, about human rights. And the two for him have been synonymous since he first began. And so it's not just about individual photographers knowing about law of copyright. It's about the way in which images are used and exploited by those who don't own them. And one of the background themes within Bangladesh has been the imagery from the 71 war, which was a really terrible war in terms of violence. I mean, all wars are, but that was one of the worst. But the images that come out of that war are now the subject of a dispute, not so much now, but who uses those images, who controls them, who controls the message of what the 71 war is about is a political football. So that's another aspect of law of copyright that feeds straight into the, if you like, into human rights or into political messages. And that's really what I find exciting about being part of that festival, is that the power of photography is so enormous, and it is no less now than it was. And Shahidul has understood that right from the beginning, and he understood that my knowledge and my similarly shared passion to him was one that would march well from the UK end to what he was doing in Bangladesh. So does that answer your question? It's rather convoluted.
No, it answers it extremely well, thank you. I mean, it's a fascinating response, and although, of course, this isn't about, it's not professional photographers in this instance at the moment in the United States, of course, almost universally, the images of protests that we are getting are people with cameras. It's not so long ago that I was rather baffled by the idea of attaching a camera to a telephone. I couldn't quite see the point of it, but it has, of course, turned into a fantastic implement, as you've said, for the protection of rights. Thank you both so much. It's been wonderful. And thank you for those who are attending as well. I know that one or two people did not receive the link to the film in time to be able to watch it beforehand, but apologies for that. Please be assured you will be able to watch it for a few days more. And I personally am never sure really whether to know about something before I engage with it, or engage with it first and learn afterwards. So I don't know which is best, but you will still be able to watch the film. Thank you. We have a number of events coming up over the next few weeks, and we will be putting out notices about those in the usual way in the forthcoming days. The next thing you'll see from us is a blog post relating to the impact of COVID-19 in Afghanistan, and that will go out tomorrow. So please look out for that. And we look forward to seeing you all again in the near future. Thank you very much.
Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Sophie.
And so for you too.